There is something I need to say to you before anything else, and I want you to hear it not as a criticism, but as an act of honesty between us. If you are eating any of the foods I'm about to describe, and statistically, you almost certainly are, you are, or most likely eating them in a way that the sacred tradition would consider incomplete. Not wrong in the sense of sin. Wrong in the sense of a key that is cut almost correctly but does not turn the lock. The form is there, the substance is missing. And the consequence of that gap is a blessing that never fully arrives. My name is Rabbi Shlomo Katz. I am 71 years old, born in Tzfat, Safed, the ancient city in northern Israel where the greatest Kabbalists in Jewish history lived, studied, and taught within walking distance of one another in the 16th century. I studied in the yeshiva of Tzfat and at Bar Ilan University, but my most essential education happened across a table from my grandfather, Reb Yosef Katz, a master Kabbalist of the school of Tzfat, who taught me from childhood that every food God placed on this earth carries what he called a spiritual code, a dimension of meaning and blessing that is inseparable from the food itself, embedded there at the moment of creation. For 43 years, I have been studying that code, and what I want to share with you today is something I believe is the single most important practical error that the modern world makes in relation to food, an error that affects healing, that affects blessing, that affects the quality and length of human life in ways that no medical journal has yet found the language to fully describe. After 43 years of study, I have identified 7 foods that appear again and again across Torah, Talmud, and Zohar as carriers of divine blessing. They are the Shivat HaMinim, the 7 sacred foods, listed explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8. Wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. God did not place these 7 foods in a description of the Holy Land by accident. My grandfather taught that this verse is not geography. It is a prescription, a divine blueprint for the nourishment of the human being at every level, body, soul, and spirit. And today, I am going to teach you what the tradition says about how these foods were designed to be received, and why the way most people eat them today prevents the healing they were created to deliver. Toward the end of this teaching, I will share something my grandfather told me during a particular Shabbat in Tzfat, a Friday evening I remember with unusual clarity, that reframed everything I thought I understood about the relationship between food and healing. Stay with me through every word. I need to take you back to Tzfat, because that is where this knowledge lives most fully for me. The old city sits on a mountain in the upper Galilee, and the air there is different from anywhere else I have known. It carries a quality of stillness that the Kabbalists described as a thinning of the boundary between worlds. My grandfather's kitchen was on the ground floor of a stone building that his own teacher had once occupied. The walls were thick and cool even in summer. There were always herbs drying near the window, and something slow cooking on the stove from before dawn on Fridays, in preparation for Shabbat. My grandfather did not cook carelessly. He did not cook quickly. And he did not cook silently. From the time I was very small, I watched him prepare food the way a cantor prepares a prayer, with awareness of every element, with deliberate intention toward a specific purpose, with what I can only describe as a relationship with the ingredients that went beyond their physical properties. I asked him once, when I was perhaps 12 years old, why he moved so slowly in the kitchen. He put down what he was holding, looked at me, and said, "Because these foods are speaking. If you move too fast, you cannot hear what they are saying." I did not fully understand that until I was much older, but it planted something in me that decades of study eventually brought into full clarity. What my grandfather was describing was not mysticism in the vague sense that word is often used. He was describing a specific practice, a set of conditions under which the sacred foods of the Shivat HaMinim deliver what they were designed to deliver. And the central principle of that practice is something the tradition calls kavana, intention. Focused, directed, conscious awareness of what you are doing and why. He learned this understanding through decades of study of the Zohar and through the oral tradition he had received from his own teachers, who traced their lineage directly to the great Kabbalists of Tzfat, the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, and his circle. This was not knowledge assembled from books alone. It was knowledge that had been lived and transmitted through direct relationship across many generations. And when he transmitted it to me, he made me understand that receiving it came with an obligation, to carry it forward with the same care with which it had been given to me. If you have ever looked at your own health and felt that something was missing, not a specific nutrient, not a specific treatment, but something more fundamental, something that the medical system around you did not seem to have a category for, write the words Shivat HaMinim in the comments below, because that feeling is what I am going to speak to today. Let me be direct with you about the world we are living in now. Chronic inflammation is what physicians increasingly describe as the underlying condition of most of the major illnesses that diminish and shorten human life in the modern world. Heart disease, metabolic dysfunction, neurological deterioration, autoimmune conditions. The research of the last 2 decades increasingly points toward inflammation not as a symptom of these conditions, but as a root environment in which they develop. The World Health Organization has described chronic disease as the leading cause of death and disability globally. These are not distant statistics. These are conditions alive inside the bodies of people eating 3 meals a day. People who believe they are doing something right. People who are consuming versions of the very foods God placed on this earth as vehicles of healing, and receiving almost none of the healing those foods were designed to give. Why? That is the question I want to answer today, and I want to answer it from the perspective of the sacred tradition, not from the perspective of nutritional science. Though I will say that in the 43 years I have been studying this, the distance between what Torah teaches and what science is slowly discovering has never stopped narrowing. The modern approach to food is built on a principle of extraction. Find what is valuable in the food, isolate it, concentrate it, deliver it efficiently. And this approach is not entirely without merit. It has produced knowledge that is genuinely useful, but it has also produced something the tradition would identify as a fundamental error, which is the belief that a food can be reduced to its components without losing something essential, that the olive can be pressed into oil at industrial speed and high heat, and what arrives in a bottle on a supermarket shelf is the same thing the Torah describes when it speaks of the olive as one of the 7 sacred foods of Israel. That wheat can be stripped of its outer layers, bleached, refined, processed into powder, and what remains carries the same spiritual and physical quality as the grain that grew in the fields of the Holy Land and was brought as an offering to the temple in Jerusalem. The tradition says it does not. The tradition says that what is lost in that process is not only measurable by chemistry. What is lost includes something that chemistry does not yet have instruments to measure. I lived this error myself. I told you in a previous teaching about the period in my late 30s when I allowed my connection to these foods to weaken. What I want to add here is that it was not only that I stopped eating certain foods, it was that when I did eat them, I ate them the way the modern world eats everything. Quickly, distractedly, without awareness of what I was receiving. I was consuming the form of the sacred foods without their substance. And My grandfather, when he came to visit that winter in Florida and sat at my table, said something I have never forgotten. He looked at the olive oil I had set out, a standard commercial product, refined, deodorized, nothing like what his kitchen in Shivat had always contained. And he said, "This was once an olive. It has forgotten what it was." And when you eat something that has forgotten what it was, you receive the forgetting along with the food. What I discovered through returning to his teaching is that this is not a loose observation. It is part of a system. 7 sacred foods that God placed in this world as a complete code for human healing, and a set of principles governing how to receive what those foods carry. My grandfather didn't teach these 7 foods separately. He taught them as a system, a complete code. And the error most people make is not only in the quality of what they eat, it is in the entire relationship they bring to these foods when they eat them. The food I want to teach you about today is the olive. In Hebrew, the zayit, one of the Shivat HaMinim, one of the 7 sacred foods listed in Deuteronomy 8:8. And I want to teach you alongside it the principle that governs not only the olive but all 7 of these foods. The principle that determines whether what you eat heals you or merely passes through you without doing what it was created to do. The olive appears in Torah for the first time not in Deuteronomy but in Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 8, verse 11, when the dove returns to Noah's ark carrying an olive branch in its mouth. The rabbis of the Talmud, in Tractate Sanhedrin, ask why God chose the olive branch as the sign of the end of the flood and the beginning of restoration. And the answer they give is remarkable, because the olive is the symbol of light that persists in darkness. The olive does not give its blessing when conditions are comfortable. It gives its greatest gift, its oil, its light, when it is pressed, when it is under pressure. The tradition teaches that this is not an incidental quality of the fruit. It is its spiritual identity. The zayit was created to model a truth about healing itself, that the deepest restoration often comes through the pressing, not despite it. In the Talmud, Tractate Menachot, the rabbis discuss the specific requirements for the oil used in the menorah, the great 7-branched candelabra that stood in the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. The oil had to be from the first pressing of the olive, extracted slowly, without heat, without the application of force beyond the olive's natural weight. This oil was called shemen zayit zak, pure, clear olive oil. And the rabbis make clear that this quality of purity was not merely a ritual requirement. It was a reflection of the oil's spiritual completeness. The first pressing, done with care and patience, produced oil that carried the full dimensionality of what the olive was. Everything beyond that, subsequent pressings, applications of heat and pressure, produced oil that was usable but diminished, functional but not complete. Rambam, Maimonides, writing in the 12th century in his medical texts, specifically recommended olive oil consumed in its unheated, first pressed form as one of the most important foods for the maintenance of what he called the balance of the body's humors, what we might today describe as systemic regulation, the body's capacity to maintain its own equilibrium against the pressures of illness and aging. He was not writing as a mystic in those pages. He was writing as a physician who understood that the physical and spiritual dimensions of a food are not separate systems. They are one system observed from 2 different angles. Now let me give you the 3 principles that the tradition teaches about how these sacred foods heal, and why most people, even when they eat them, receive almost none of what they carry. The first principle is what I call the principle of completeness, and it is the most violated principle in the modern food relationship. Every one of the Shivat HaMinim was created to be received in its whole and complete form. not extracted, not isolated, not processed into something convenient. The wheat of Torah is not the flour on a modern supermarket shelf. The olive of Torah is not the refined, heat-processed oil in a plastic bottle. The grape of Torah is not the grape-flavored compound in a mass-produced product. The tradition teaches in the Zohar and Parashat Terumah that each of the 7 sacred foods carries what is called a levish, a garment. The outer form of the food, including its skin, its fiber, its natural structure, is not incidental packaging to be discarded before the real content is extracted. The levish is part of the food's spiritual completeness. When you remove it, you receive a fraction of what was offered. My grandfather used to say, when you peel away the garment, the blessing goes with it. This principle becomes 10 times more powerful when understood across all 7 of the sacred foods. Because the tradition does not teach that completeness is a quality of individual foods in isolation. It teaches that the 7 foods together form a complete system, and that eating even one of them in its whole form while the others are absent or degraded is like playing a single note from a chord that requires all 7 strings. Something is present, but the resonance, the full harmonic of blessing, is not. The second principle is what I call the principle of preparation with awareness, and this is where my grandfather's slowness in the kitchen finds its deepest explanation. In the Talmud, Tractate Bereshot, the rabbis established that no food should be eaten without a blessing, a bracha, spoken with full attention before and after. This is not a formality. The tradition is explicit that a blessing spoken without kavana, without directed conscious intention, does not accomplish what a blessing with kavana accomplishes. And this teaching extends beyond the blessing itself into the entire act of preparation. The Zohar teaches that the consciousness with which a food is prepared enters the food, that a meal prepared with awareness of its sacred dimension carries something that a meal prepared carelessly does not carry. This is the principle my grandfather embodied in his kitchen in Tzfat. He was not slow because he was unhurried. He was slow because he understood that what he was doing had 2 dimensions, and the second dimension required his full presence. The practical application of this principle is not complicated. It does not require training that most people do not have. It requires only a shift in the relationship you bring to the food before you eat it. A moment of recognition that what you are about to receive was created specifically and intentionally, that it carries something beyond its chemical composition, and that your awareness of that fact is itself a form of preparation that changes what you receive. The tradition calls this hachana, preparation, and it teaches that hachana is not only physical, it is the interior condition of the person who receives the blessing. The third principle is the one my grandfather shared with me on that particular Friday evening in Tzfat that I have been holding through this entire teaching. I was perhaps 32 years old. We had finished the Shabbat meal, and the house was quiet in the way that Shabbat houses in Tzfat become quiet, a specific quality of stillness that I have never found anywhere else. He looked at me across the table and said, "Shlomo, do you know why God created food before he created hunger?" I said I did not understand the question. He said, "Think about it. Hunger is the need. Food is the answer." But God placed the answer before he created the need. What does that tell you about the nature of the answer? I have sat with that question for nearly 40 years, and what I have come to understand is this. The sacred foods of the Shivat HaMinim were not created in response to human hunger. They were created as an expression of divine abundance, placed in the world before the need existed, waiting to be received. And The tradition teaches that this sequence carries a specific spiritual instruction. You do not approach these foods from a place of lack. You approach them from a place of receiving what was already prepared for you before you knew you needed it. This shift from eating out of lack to eating out of gratitude for what was already provided is what the tradition calls the correct orientation toward food. And it is, according to the Zohar, the internal condition that allows the healing dimension of the Shivat HaMinim to fully activate. This is why most people eat them wrong, not because of what they eat, because of the orientation from which they eat it. I want to be honest with you about something personal. There were years when I taught this principle to others while failing to practice it myself in any consistent way. The gap between teaching and living is one of the most humbling aspects of a scholar's life. I understood the principle of eating from abundance rather than lack. I could articulate it in 3 languages. And yet, when I sat at my own table, I ate with the urgency and distraction of a person responding to need, quickly, mechanically, already thinking about the next thing. The consequence of that gap was not dramatic. It was quiet and cumulative. A gradual disconnection from the quality of aliveness that the tradition associates with receiving the blessing of these foods fully. When I returned to the practice, not perfectly, but genuinely, the reconnection was also quiet and cumulative. But it was real. The world needs this teaching now with an urgency I feel more every year. We are surrounded by a food system that has mastered the extraction of form while losing the substance entirely. People are eating more and nourishing less, consuming calories while starving for something they cannot name. The sacred tradition has always had a name for what they are starving for. It is bracha, blessing. And the 7 sacred foods, received with completeness and with the correct interior orientation, are among the primary channels through which that blessing enters a human life. My grandfather spent his entire life organizing these 7 teachings into a complete system. It took me decades to understand how deeply they connect. What I have given you today, the olive, the principle of completeness, the principle of preparation with awareness, and the principle of receiving from abundance rather than lack. These are the foundations. The system is larger. Each of the 7 sacred foods carries its own dimension of this teaching, and when they are understood together, what emerges is something that I believe every human being on this earth was meant to have access to. Let me bring this together for you now. Today, you received a teaching built around one of the Shivat HaMinim, the olive, the zayit, and the 3 principles the tradition teaches about how the sacred foods of Deuteronomy 8:8 were designed to heal. The principle of completeness, that these foods carry their blessing in their whole form, and what is extracted or refined loses the garment that the blessing wears. The principle of preparation with awareness, that kavana, conscious intention, is not a ceremony performed over the food, but a quality of presence that changes what you receive. And the principle of receiving from abundance, that the orientation from which you approach the sacred foods determines whether their healing dimension activates or remains closed. This knowledge is yours now. You do not need special training to begin. You need only to bring one of these foods, the olive in its first pressed, unrefined, complete form, back to your table. Eat it with awareness. Eat it with a moment of recognition for what it carries. Eat it knowing that it was placed in this world before your hunger existed, as an expression of provision that preceded the need. That is the practice at this level. That is where it begins. Use this knowledge with the intention it deserves. Do not use it casually. Do not reduce it to a wellness strategy or a dietary optimization. receive it as the sacred tradition intended it, as a gift that comes with the responsibility of using it for good, for the blessing of your home, for the health of those you love. In my next teaching, I will reveal another of the 7 sacred foods, one that my grandfather said was the most misunderstood in all of Torah. For generations, rabbis have taught its most surface meaning, while its deepest healing principle remained almost entirely unspoken. You will not want to miss that teaching. If this reached something in you today, please share it with someone whose table and whose health you care about. Leave a comment below. Tell me which of the 3 principles landed most fully for you. Subscribe and enable notifications so you do not miss what comes next, because these teachings build on one another and the sequence matters. Shabbat Shalom. Until next time.